Welcome, Campfire Crew. Let's get it on. The Weirdo by Todd F. I got a hankering to go camping, but as happens so often, by the time I'd get my stuff together and researched a few possibilities, hovering over the book it button for a car share to get past the suburbs, it was late in the day, siesta time in fact. Figured I'd lost my chance, but then around 5:30 I got a second wind of yearning. I determined to try something risky I'd long fantasized about. I hopped on my Brompton folding bike and headed for the forest park. I would find a secluded pair of trees and just hang for the night. No trace and out at dawn. I rode along Highway 30 almost as far as the St. John's Bridge, then tucked into the woods west. Pushed a ways along an overgrown fire road, and when the brambles and nettles grew too thick, I pushed the bike aside and locked it to a small tree out of sight, marking the GPS coordinates. I slung my bag on my back and continued maybe a quarter of a mile bushwhacking, scrambling up loose slopes until the din below of trucks and Harleys was drowned out by birdsong and the wind in the trees. I happened upon what I thought to be a deer traced through the brush. Deer prints even, but also boot prints. Well, they didn't seem fresh, maybe from before the last rains. But then I nearly stumbled over a mound of dozens of pairs of rotting shoes and other clothing, green and black and collapsing. I took note of it, but moved onward. Finally, maybe a half-mile down from the road and far from the closest trail, two trees nicely spaced, with Mount Hood framed gloriously in red-orange sunset. I thought it was perfect, so I strung up my hammock, and it took a little bit to get the angle right. I had to tie some knots in my rig to try to prevent some slippage, and making adjustments was slow. Pretty soon, I was being assaulted by mosquitoes in the falling light. I zipped up the bug net with relief, and finally reclined in the woods, relaxing. Peace. About 3 times in 30 minutes, I heard what sounded like a snapping stick or an unusual short animal vocalization. Maybe the sticks were falling from the trees, or maybe some deer. Then suddenly, "Hey, why are you here?" I convulsed right up in my hammock, dropping my phone. This guy approached in the dusky light, got about 3 feet from me. Long hair, tall, bearded, demeanor not threatening, but certainly not shy. Sorry, I didn't know anybody was near," I said.
"You're in my way. My camp is up there. When are you leaving?"
I mean no trouble. My name's Todd."
"I don't believe anything you say. How did you breach the barrier?"
I just...
Cubic boron nitrate. The mountain is a sphere of cubic boron nitrate. It's an impenetrable barrier. I don't believe anything you say."
And with that, he ducked under my suspension and trudged away upslope. "Good night," I called after him. He didn't say anything. Less than 10 minutes later, I was consulting my phone for the coordinates of my bike in the dark, all packed up. I hit the road by brilliant dynamo light, seeming so much brighter than the overlit city. I was back home an hour later, home sweet hammock, snuggling my cat. Bigfoot or Something Else, submitted by Anonymous. I know you know my real name, but I'm asking that you not use it for Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories, for the story that I've submitted. I love camping and hiking stories just as much as the next guy, and I felt compelled to share something terrifying that happened to me and my best friend in 2001. My best friend and I decided to go out and do some hiking and camping for a few days in the state of Washington where we lived. We were 26 at the time, both newly married, and both our wives had given birth to our first children in the last 2 years. They were going to get together with the kids a few times and do mom stuff while we took a break from both working and caring for the kids. We married really great women to allow us to do this. We knew we wanted to travel light, but we were going tent camping, so we kept most of our food and stuff to dehydrated meals and easy-to-make things like rice and noodles and so on. I was also a huge salami freak, so I made sure to pack a lot of that sort of thing with cheese and other goodies like chocolates and trail mix, stuff like that. We were going to do everything on our little packable stoves, so we also had extra bottles of fuel, and that was about it for the heavy stuff. We did bring along our shotguns that we strapped to our backpacks, and we picked an extremely remote area to go as we didn't want to see other people, just wanted to enjoy nature and our conversations. I had also recently purchased a digital camera and thought I could snap pictures of the things that we found along our stay. I don't know if anyone remembers how big digital cameras were back then, but it was a compromise with extra weight. But being a tech geek, I was really into that sort of thing and could not pass up the chance of bringing it along. My best friend, whom I will call John for this story, also brought along his black lab, Smokey. That also meant extra weight for him to carry with dog food and treats. But Smokey was like a third brother to us, and he loved to hike and camp as much as we did. I left my golden retriever at home. She was amazing, but Ginger was not a huge camping dog. Her style was more of a lay around the house and get fawned over style. So we loaded everything up the night before in John's Jeep and decided to head out pretty early. It was a Thursday morning when we left off, and other than stopping for some coffee and snacks for the ride, we set out and we were on our way. We only stopped one time for lunch, and we just kept talking about how awesome this was going to be and what a blast we were going to have. We got to a spot where we could park and get going on foot, and we were thrilled to see that there were no other cars around. Even in the most remote areas of this country, it seems like there's always some kind of asshole out there that you'll come across to ruin the time that you're having. I'm not trying to be negative, it's just the truth. It's like the old adage, if you get lost, sit down and start playing solitaire, and someone is sure enough to come up and tell you that you've made the wrong move. Our plan was to hike out about 4 hours the first day and camp early, wake up early the next day, and continue on to another spot before staying there for 2 days, and then just doing the reverse to get back to the Jeep. It was gorgeous weather. It was summertime and everything was deep green, smelled amazing, and it was just so cool to hear the sounds of the forest and feel the breeze when you got out of the trees, crossing fields and stopping at the rivers and streams that we came up to clean up and get more water. If anybody cares, I had brought along a supply of iodine tablets for our water supply just in case, but John was also testing out this new water filtration pump that seemed to work pretty good. Anyway, we stopped at a place to camp that was very suitable for what we wanted, unpacked our stuff, and got ready to set up camp. We pitched our tent, John tended to Smokey, and I took a small hatchet and started gathering tinder, kindling, and firewood for the evening. It was probably around 4 when I heard something way off in the distance. Now, if you've ever been way out in the wilderness, you can hear all kinds of animals up close and from far away, and second guess what it actually is. Sound travels very differently out there, and what you might think is one kind of animal could actually be something very, very different. John and I had been hunting with our father since we were kids and had been out in areas like this we were out in right now for all of our lives. We are by no means experts on flora and fauna, but we know enough to make educated guesses as to what things are. As I was chopping up a small log and taking off its dead branches, I heard what sounded like a deep howl way off in the distance. It was sort of a howl ending with a whoop. It lasted for a good 8 seconds, and I sat listening, thinking maybe it was a bear, but if so, that's a pretty loud bear. I waited for about a minute, and it came again, way off in the distance. I sat there listening, but I didn't hear it for another 5 minutes and got back to work. I was just going to ask John if he had heard it. I wasn't too far from our campsite, so he had to have heard it. I dragged some more deadfalls back up to our campsite and unloaded all of the branches I had collected. Before I could say anything, John asked me, "Hey, Gary, did you just hear that howling?" I said, "Yeah, I was going to ask you. What do you think it was? A bear?" John said, "I don't know. If it was, it's an unbelievably large bear or something's wrong with it." Right away, we ruled out cougars or coyotes, as they don't sound anything like that. Well, we heard it, and it became a topic of conversation as he got some food started and was playing around with Smokey, keeping him occupied. After a while, we kind of let it go and just started eating and talking about what we were going to do the next day. We sat around the fire for a little while and let it die down before retiring for the night. We crawled into our tent with Smokey at our feet, and it didn't take long to fall asleep after the trip and the hike out there. Sometime during the night, I woke up thirsty and reached for my water bottle. It was really quiet, and outside the sound of the wind through the trees was so comforting. I took another swig and was just about to lay back down when I heard that howl again, way off in the distance. I sat motionless, thinking about what the heck it could be. I didn't want to wake up John, and Smokey was sound asleep too. I saw no point in bothering either of them. So I waited and waited, but didn't hear it again. I just went back to sleep and slept soundly for the rest of the night. When I woke up, first thing I said to John was, "Hey, I heard that howl again last night." I woke up for a drink of water, and it was the same sound, and it sounded like it was coming from the same distance away. He looked at me and said, "No kidding." "Well, whatever it is, I hope we don't run into it." Prophetic words. We got some breakfast, checked our gear, and then packed everything up. We started our trek to the next spot, and again had an unbelievably enjoyable day as we made our way to where we would make camp again. We stopped for lunch and consulted a topo map and spotted a place that looked ideal for a 2-day stay. It was near a stream, and there was a pond about a quarter of a mile away. It was in a meadow on the edge of a forest, sort of like the night before, but now we had water. It took another hour to get to the spot, and when we found the right place, we again set up camp. Pitched our tent, stored our gear, gathered wood, and so on. And that's the way the afternoon went. We decided to have an early dinner and then just hang out by the fire. John had not told me that he had brought a little liquid refreshment for us. We could just enjoy the evening talking and sipping on a little Johnny Walker Black. I made some noodles with salami. I know that sounds gross, but trust me, it was delicious. We ate, and then I started a fire. Smokey was acting a little restless, so John decided to take him for a walk down to the stream and let him play a little bit more, even though he had walked as far as we had. He was a pretty good-sized lab, probably about 65 pounds, and in very good shape. But for whatever reason, he had just not had his exercise fix for the day. I sat in front of the fire whittling a stick just for fun. And then I couldn't believe my ears. That howl came again, but it was a hell of a lot closer than it was the night before. I knew immediately that it was no bear. This was no animal that walked on 4 legs. I know that sounds weird, but it had this massive bass to it, and this time, how it ended in 3 distinct whoops. It seemed like all of the other sounds of nature stopped. At least they did for me as I was focusing my attention on that. I waited for it to come again, but it didn't. However, John came running up with Smokey, and I knew he was about to ask me if I had heard it. Before he could say anything, I said, "Yeah, I heard that." The debate started again as to what it was. And just for precautions, we made sure that our shotguns were ready if we needed them. We weren't so worried about being attacked by an animal, but who knows if some whack job was out there making those noises. I suppose it could have been a man, but in retrospect, and what happened a little bit later, we now know it wasn't. We had our fire and just kept talking about that and sipping on the Johnny Walker. Conversation finally drifted to other things, like our jobs and families, and we kind of forgot about the howling. As the fire dwindled and we got ready to hit the sack, I wandered off to commune with Mother Nature, and that's when the howl came again, this time ending with only 1 whoop. But what was new this time was, a little farther away, we heard another howl, a little higher pitched, with no whoop at the end. I hurried up, finished my business, and got back to the safety of what little fire we had left. I gotta admit, I was a little spooked. If this was man-made, well, now that made 2 of them out there in the dark, making funny noises. And really, for what reason would they be doing that? For whose entertainment would it be for? John started nodding his head, and then said, "Gary, I think it's a good idea if we bring the shotguns inside the tent with us tonight." I agreed, and after a little bit more conversation, we crawled in the tent and went to sleep. Even though we had worked hard all day, sleep was hard coming that night. I just couldn't fall asleep. I finally did, but not long later I woke up to Smokey growling lowly. His head was up and looking towards the left wall of the tent. John had obviously heard it too, and sat up on his elbows. There was a little moon out, so there was some light coming from the outside, and we saw Smokey dip his head once more, but all the while still growling. Then something hit my nostrils that almost made me puke. It was this horrendous smell, like a dead skunk wrapped in garbage and then set in the sun for a few days. I mean, this smelled so damn bad I actually gagged. John had actually pulled out a handkerchief and had placed it over his nose, and even Smokey's nose was twitching. I mean, something smelled like holy hell. We sat listening and looking at each other and wondering what the hell was going on. Finally I whispered, "Maybe there's a deer carcass or something upwind, and now it's just flowing down to us." I know that was kind of a weak thing to say, but I didn't know what else to say. John said, "Yeah, maybe that's possible, but even though, I think we would have noticed something earlier today." Smokey stopped growling and started to put his head back down as if he was going to sleep. And that's when the howl came again, this time up close and personal. Whatever this thing was, man or animal, it was not far away at all. And again, we sat there, and finally, John said, "Gary, what are we going to do?" And I rolled over to get my shotgun and sit it across my lap as I was now sitting up. "Well," I said, "if something's coming near us, I suppose a few rounds will scare it off." He agreed, and did the same thing as me, picking up his 1187. We sat in silence for what seemed like an hour, and nothing came. The smell had left by now, but we were kind of keyed up, and I decided to stay up a little longer to see if anything would happen, and told John he could get some sleep. As we weren't going to be leaving the campsite for another day, I figured I could just take a nap later that morning or even in the afternoon. I stayed up for another 3 hours listening and frankly waiting, but nothing happened. It was now 4 in the morning, and it would be dawn soon. I was tired at this point, so I laid back down to get a few winks in, and I hadn't been out for more than a half hour when John was violently shaking my arm. I rolled up to say what, and he told me to be quiet. Smokey had his head up again, and now had that low growl going, but that's not what I noticed at first. In the pre-dawn light, something was outside of our campsite. It was to the east of us, but we could hear something walking through the edge of the forest and into the meadow where we were. We both grabbed our shotguns and chambered slugs. We sat quietly until we heard these footsteps somehow get louder and faster. I mean, they were really pounding on the ground and shaking it. Here's where we had to start making some decisions, because something big that we didn't know what it was came running through our campsite. It ran right by us, and Smokey jumped up and started barking, and that stench came back. It lingered for a bit before going away as the footsteps receded into the distance. I don't curse that much, but I looked at John and said, "What the fuck was that?" He just shook his head. We sat there waiting to see if something else was going to happen, but it didn't. The sun came up and it seemed like all was well. Smokey started fidgeting like he had to go to the bathroom, and as much as I had to talk myself into going out of the tent, I knew that nothing was wrong out there. I was working myself up, probably over a coyote or some kind of other animal that ran through the campsite. Oh, the things you will do and say to yourself to avoid talking about a situation that you don't want to. We both crawled out of the tent, and Smokey ran out to do his thing, and as soon as he was done, started sniffing around the ground like crazy. I mean, he was really going to town like he was on the hunt for something. I stretched, looked at John as he called for Smokey, and then started walking towards him. But then he stopped dead in his tracks. In the light dusting of the dirt which we had set up camp on, there were huge footprints. I mean, big footprints. And they looked human, almost. However, they were 17 inches long. We did our best to guesstimate by putting our feet next to them, and there were a series of them with extremely long strides between them. I took out my digital camera and started taking pictures. I had John put his hand and foot next to one of them and took a picture of that. We both looked at each other, and he finally said, "Gary, are you thinking what I'm thinking?" I was, but I didn't want to admit that we were looking at something we had always thought was a bunch of fairy tales. As I mentioned, We grew up in this area, in the wilderness, so we were more than familiar with the folklore and all the stories these weirdos talk about seeing something in the forest and calling it Bigfoot. But now, there we were, looking at some really big feet. I said we needed a cup of coffee and something to eat to properly mull this over. I mean, my first inclination was to be scared and say, let's get the hell out of here. But after we talked about things for the better part of an hour and a half, John said, "What if you could get a picture of it?" I said, "Are you nuts?" And he said, "Well, look, it ran right through here and could have done some pretty serious damage, but it didn't. I mean, maybe it's just been checking us out and wanted to see who we are and what we're up to." I started to see his point, but I also started to think, yeah, well, if it's something that big and it decides to change its mind, we're up shit creek without a paddle. John simply pointed to our shotguns propped up against our packs and said, "I'm pretty sure we could scare it off if we had to." We decided to think about it and go for a short walk to the stream to replenish our water and just check things out down there. It was also a good way for Smokey to run around. We finally came to the decision we were going to continue our trip as we had planned and stay out there for one more night. I'm sure as you are reading this, Uncle Josh, you're probably saying to yourself, these guys are out of their heads. And I'm sure people who are listening to this are saying the same thing. But we were 26 and thinking, how amazing would it be if we were the guys to come up with real evidence for something like Bigfoot? We also talked about what else it could have been, but we thought that was stupid because we saw the footprints and we had pictures of those. There was nothing else that this could be. So we went through the day doing other activities, but our minds were on if that thing was coming back and if we would be ready for it. We gathered more wood late in the day for another fire and decided to stay up later to see if anything would happen. It started to get on towards 9, and it was dark, and we were waiting for the moon to come up. The anticipation of something happening is sometimes harder to deal with than something actually happening. I couldn't take the tension and had a swig of the Johnny Walker, and so did John. And that's when we heard a louder howl coming from the area where the pond was. It did it more than once, and I thought that if we could sneak over there and take whatever it was by surprise, we could get a shot. I mean, we had no idea about how Bigfoot hears or sees or whatever. We only had experience with animals and their highly tuned senses. What if this thing was just like a human being that we knew we could sneak up on? We decided we would do that and leave Smokey in the tent. However, that turned out to be non-fruitful. As we made our way towards the pond and hearing the howl once more, Smokey had escaped the tent and started running towards us, and then right by us. He was trying to follow the howl, and for the first time was not listening to John's calls. He was not coming back for any reason. We started running after him, and John kept saying, "Why didn't I chain him up? Why didn't I chain him up?" And I told him, "Don't worry about it." It didn't take us too long to go the roughly quarter mile to the pond, when we heard a massive howl, the loudest one we'd ever heard, and then the sound of Smokey crying out, and then the sound of a massive splash in the water. We didn't even look at each other, and immediately sprinted towards the edge of the pond. In the dim moonlight, we saw Smokey swimming towards shore, and John frantically calling him back with his commands. Smokey got out of the water, crawled up the small bank, and then ran towards us and immediately sat at John's feet, panting heavily with this crazed look in his eye and foam on his mouth. It took me over a minute to notice the giant figure standing literally 20 yards away from us, just standing looking at us. I couldn't make out any features, just this massive shape. I mean, it had to have been at least 8 feet tall, I could tell that. The moonlight did let us see that it was covered with hair, and I can only describe it as massive. It didn't make any sounds. It just stood there for another minute or so, and then turned around and walked off along the edge of the pond away from us. A few minutes later, we heard the higher-pitched howl a little ways away from us, and then the louder, lower bass howl back, obviously closer to us, as it must have been the thing that we had just seen. I'm not crazy. I know some people who I've told this story to say I am, but John was there too, and whatever it was that happened to Smokey, we can only speculate. But from the way it sounded like whatever this thing was startled by the dog, and either picked him up and threw him or hit him so hard that he flew out into the pond. That time, I never once thought that I should follow whatever it was. and I'm going to refer to it as Bigfoot, because it had to have been. We waited until the next day to go back, to see those same huge footprints around the sand around the areas of the edge of the pond. But at that evening, we went back to the camp, stoked up the fire as high as we could get it, and I skirted the edge of the forest within eyeshot of our camp to get more wood. We were staying up all night. We didn't hear anything else, and the next day we quickly picked up and got out of there. We stayed at the first camp the last night again with nothing happening. We considered just hiking all the way back to the Jeep, but we knew that we wouldn't have the energy to do that and then make the trip home. Again, I know people say I'm crazy and question what really happened, saying if that was them, they would have gotten out of there right away. For some reason outside of the fact that it did something to Smokey, it didn't seem like it was violent or looking to hurt us. We think it was just curious. The trip ended with our hike back to the Jeep and then our drive home. I reviewed the pictures of the footprints, and I did send them to an organization for their thoughts, and they basically just said, "Yep, that looks like Sasquatch. You mind if we share these with others?" I laughed and said, "That's fine, but don't use my name." I still have those pictures and the memories of what happened to us, and that's all I need. So that's my Bigfoot story. I'm still an avid camper, hiker, and hunter, and I've been in lots of places all over the Northwest and talked to a lot of people who have said that they've seen something similar to what we did. I was a non-believer, but now I am a full-fledged believer, because I know what happened to us out there. I'm not afraid of the woods, and I'm not afraid of running into another Bigfoot. But in a strange way, sometimes I hope I do. The Fight by Rich D. My first camping trip was in 1977. I was 10 and my brother was 7. Our father grew up in the woods of Michigan, living a subsistence-type lifestyle with his parents up until he graduated high school. He was always very comfortable in the wilderness and always shared his knowledge and experience with us boys. I don't recall what lake we were on, but we went in through the numbered lakes. We were on an island campsite, and I woke up to a loud ruckus outside our tent. Something was scuffling just outside. I didn't worry or panic. I was with Dad after all, and he wasn't worried as well. Right? Well, I rolled over and saw him laying on top of his sleeping bag. My dad opened a window, and in the moonlight, all I got from him was his finger to keep his lips motioning for me to be quiet, and then he mouthed, "Lay still." Now the ruckus outside the tent had my full attention, and I couldn't very clearly hear the snarling and screeching and lots of brush snapping and rustling. It couldn't have lasted long, but it felt like an eternity, and finally, everything quieted, and my dad got up and left the tent, telling us to stay there. Staying calm would not be easy. 10 minutes later, he comes back in, lays down, and all he says is, "Everything's okay, go to sleep." Yeah, right. I lay there half awake the night before adrenaline wore off enough for me to sleep. In the morning, as I woke up my brother, who had slept right through everything, my dad heard us in the tent and said, "Hey, hurry up, come out and see what happened last night." Not even 20 feet from the tent were 2 3-inch diameter trees sheared off and broken. There were several bear tracks, and what my dad said was either a lynx or a cougar. We have no idea why they were fighting. I guess maybe it was food. But there was a little blood, so we didn't know if it was just a meal or they were fighting one another. When my dad had gotten out of the tent, he had seen a bear swimming away from the shore. The only time I ever saw my dad nervous in the outdoors. Nowadays, the encounter has been a classic campfire tale. Every time I took a trip with my dad up there after that, it was always a campfire staple, and a couple of times while just out fishing in the boat it would come up, with many other stories of his youth. It always gets funnier the older we get, though. But the night that it happened was pretty terrifying. It was a really good teaching moment for my dad to us, though. Identifying the tracks, why animals would fight, why they didn't attack us, and why it was a good idea to leave that campsite that next morning. Psycho Camping Family, submitted by Paulie D's Nuts. A while back, I decided to take my family camping. Not the stuff I did when I was younger, way out in the middle of the woods with minimal equipment, but, the family campground thing. My son and daughter had never tent camped before, and I really wanted them to get into it so they could do the things that I did when I was younger, when they got older. I still live in the area that I grew up in, and chose a campground that my parents took me to when I was a kid. Super nice place with lots of things to do, and lots of campsites. I checked all my gear and actually put my tent up in my backyard to make sure that everything was still in good shape, and it was. Everyone was excited to go, so I made reservations a couple of weeks in advance before to make sure that we were on a loop that didn't have tons of people, but still had some. I hate overcrowded campgrounds, but I was also hoping to have a couple of other families in a loop, so maybe my son and daughter would find some kids to play with, and my wife and I could just relax and wouldn't have to entertain them all day long. So, I loaded up the Suburban the night before we were going to leave, told everybody we were going to be leaving midday, and to make sure that they had everything else they wanted to bring. And in that case, my kids, that meant their handheld devices. My son had just gotten a PSP, and he was all about that. His younger sister had a Leapster or Frogster or something like that my wife bought her. Anyway, I should mention that my son was 10 years old at the time and my daughter was 8. So, with extra batteries and a vehicle full of gear and food, we set off for the hour drive to the campground. Everyone was in high spirits. The weather was awesome, and we were looking forward to some hiking, swimming, canoeing, and just hanging out in the forest and enjoying everything about this really cool place. We checked in with the forest ranger and drove to our loop and backed in. I immediately got my son to help me pitch the tent, while my wife and daughter unloaded the rest of the stuff. I was very happy with our site selection, as there was a picnic table, and we had a pop-up shelter to go over that to keep out the bugs. And there were a few other families, too, some with kids my son's age, some older. There were about 12 sites on our loop with a bathhouse and a little commissary about a quarter of a mile away in case we ran out of one thing or another. We were planning on staying the week, and I knew we would have to refill our provisions at a bigger store outside of the campground, but I'll tell you what, that place was a meeting place for a lot of the kids, and it did save my butt a few times with things that I forgot to pack. The first night was awesome. We had a campfire and everything was really great. We were enjoying hot dogs over the fire and s'mores afterwards. My kids were just having a blast hanging around our campsite and exploring the little creek that ran behind it. On the second day, my son saw some kids playing kickball, and they were his age, so he asked if he could go over and see if he could play. I said, of course, and just be careful. My wife and I are always conscious of where our kids are, and what they're up to, and who they're hanging out with, but we're not helicopter parents, and we do allow our kids to have a little bit of freedom. My daughter at that time, not so much, but if my son wanted to go where I could actually watch what he was doing, and I was all for it. The more friends you can have, especially in a place like that, the better off your time is going to be. So, off he runs to make some new friends, which I was super happy with. That afternoon, I was happy to just sit in a chair reading a book, having a beer and looking up every once in a while to make sure my son was okay and having fun. He came back in the afternoon for a snack and told me about the cool kids that he had just met. I told him that I was really happy for him. It's not that he had a hard time making friends, but like I said, when you're on vacation, I do remember it being a little difficult to just introduce yourself to a bunch of strangers. That evening, we were going to go on a short hike before it got too dark, and then go back for another campfire. My son was a little bummed that he couldn't go hang out with his friends, but I told him that tomorrow was another day, and everything would be just as fun as today. However, that's when the weirdness started. What did happen is one of his friends came over to our campsite and saw my son playing with his PSP the next morning. He asked if he could play, and my son, being the nice guy, said, sure. The boy was really nice, and he was the same age as my son, and his mother and father came wandering over a little later, and my wife and I had a great conversation with them. They were about the same age as us, with an only child, and we invited them over for lunch, and they accepted, and we had also made some new friends. That afternoon, all the kids wanted to get together again to play kickball. I didn't care. I thought that was fine. The 4 parents were going to hang out with my daughter, begging to go play as well, and I said, as long as you listen to your brother, you stay where we can see you, have a good time. They did have a good time and came back, but this time another kid came over, one that we hadn't met yet. Something seemed a little off about him. He wasn't handicapped or anything like that. There was just something off about him. I mean, nice kid, but I just couldn't put my finger on what was making me think that there was something wrong. I would soon find out. He also asked to play my son's PlayStation, but my son was actually playing it at the time and said he was in the middle of a game, and if he finished, he would let him play. After a while, it was obvious that that wasn't going to happen. As time wore on, this kid was just getting fidgety and irritated that my son wouldn't let him play with the PSP. Finally, it was dinner time, and I told my son that he had to put the PSP down and we were going to eat. This kid immediately jumped up and said, "Can I play with it now?" I told him that we were going to eat, but maybe later, and he should probably go and see what his family was doing. He kind of pouted and stamped his feet, but then, without a word, ran off to his campsite. That night we had yet another campfire, and I broke out my guitar, was just playing and singing some songs with my family singing along too. From out of the darkness comes this kid. He stands at the edge of the light from our campfire until I say, "Hey bud, what's going on?" He says, "Can I play with the PSP now?" I told him it was kind of late for that and we had put the PSP away, but maybe tomorrow if my son thought it was okay. Again, he pouted and ran off, and at this point my son told me, "Dad, I don't like that kid very much. He's kind of a bully to some of the other kids, and he's actually kind of a whiner." I started laughing when he called him a whiner and said, "Well, we gotta be nice to everybody, so let's see what happens tomorrow and we'll take it from there, okay?" Not long after that, we put the fire out and went to sleep. The next day, we all went for a swim and then went canoeing in the lake at the campground, and we're having a great time. Instead of going back to the campsite, we went into a town about a half-hour away for some lunch. I also wanted to get a couple of things from the store to replenish what we had used. We were gone for the better part of the day, and when we got back, it was time for us to eat again. While we were having dinner, this kid comes up for the third time asking to play with the PSP. At this point, I know the story's long, and not really much has happened, but it's actually important for what actually happens next. I tell him again we're eating, and we'll have to talk about it later. I'm getting tired of this. This time the kid says, "I don't fucking believe you. You've been lying to me this whole time. You're all a bunch of assholes." And then he took off. Now, I swear around my kids probably more than I should, but all of us were shocked with the mouth on this kid. I didn't know who his parents were, but if I found out and bumped into them, I was going to say something. I don't like that kind of language in front of my daughter, especially. Darkness started falling, and I was getting up another fire. It's not quite dark yet when some guy comes up and says, "Hey, are you the father of the kid with the video game?" I look at him and I say, "I suppose I could be. I mean, I don't know if any of the other families have kids with video games." He gets closer, and I can tell he's been drinking or something. He's kind of stumbling a little bit, and he's slurring his words. He says, "Okay, I'll be more specific. Are you the father of the kid with the video game who keeps promising my kid he can play with it?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I have told him that, but we've been busy and we've been doing other family things, so we really haven't had a time for him to play with it." The guy says, "Well, there's no time like the present. Why don't you give me the game so my kid can play with it?" I can't remember how much I paid for the PSP, but I'm sure it was more than $100 at least. I just say to him, "I'm not really comfortable handing over a video game system like that. If we can work something out tomorrow, let's do that." This guy is now in my face, and he again says, "Well, like I said, there's no time like the present, and I think you should hand over that video game." I'm not going to be Mr. Nice Guy anymore. I tell him, "Step back, out of my face, and it's a good idea if he went back to his campsite." He says, "What are you going to do about it?" And I say, "Look, we're both adults. We're too old for that kind of stuff. I just think you better go back to your site." He just kind of looks at me as if he's thinking about shoving me or taking a swing, but he doesn't say anything other than muttering under his breath, "Asshole." Then he leaves. I'm thinking, okay, that's over. Let's get on with the night. But no, suddenly here comes a woman who we figure out pretty fast is this guy's wife. I say hello, and she walks right past me and goes up to my wife and calls her a bitch and says, "Why won't you let my kid play with the video game?" My wife says, number one, don't talk to me like that. And number two, I've just decided your kid is not going to play with the video game ever. Now get out of my campsite. My wife's kind of a badass. I try to keep things cool. This woman also looks like she's trying to slap my wife or something, but then walks away. My wife comes over to me and whispers, I think they're either drunk or high or something. And I agree. I mean, something was definitely off with the entire family. So I say, what are we going to do? Let's just have another fire tonight. And we did. More s'mores, and I swear to God, my kids probably gained 10 pounds that week just from the sweets. Later that night, we had gone to bed, but sometime after midnight, I can't remember exactly when, I heard something or someone rummaging around our campsite. At first I thought maybe it was raccoons or, oh God, I hope it's not a bear. But it could be, so I grabbed my flashlight, and without trying to wake the kids or my wife, I go to the door of our tent and slowly unzip it so I can look outside and see what's going on. It's not a bear, it's not raccoons. It's the shape of a guy who's going through all of our stuff. I snap my light on and say, hey, what are you doing? It's the guy. He freezes and then kind of stands up with a what are you going to do about it look on his face. I get out of the tent, and I'm just in my boxers holding a flashlight, and I say, I think you really need to go back to your campsite right now, or I'm going to call the forest ranger. He sort of laughs and pulls out a frickin' knife. He says, I think you better hand over that video game right now. I'm taken aback, and by this point my wife is awake, and I tell her to call the forest ranger right now. She says something about not knowing the number, and I'm short with her, and I say, it's one of the last ones on my phone, just do it. I walk over to this guy, and I tell him, look, buddy, I've been really nice about all this, but I'm telling you right now, if you don't get out of my campsite, I'm going to hand your ass to you. He makes another stupid laugh, and the next thing I know, I'm seeing stars. I did not see his wife standing off to the side, who hit me upside the head with a log. And I fell down, dropping the flashlight, putting my hand up to my head to get my bearings, as this guy starts walking towards me, waving the knife, saying, give me the video game. At this point, the fog is starting to clear from my head, and I'm on my knees, so I jump forward, getting him at his knees and dropping him to the ground. I'm now on top of this guy who stinks to high hell, who's got a knife and keeps yelling out, what the fuck is your problem? What the fuck is your problem? I can sense that his wife is coming up behind me again, and instinctively I stick my foot out, and she tripped over me, falling right behind us. I get out of this guy's grasp, but I can tell that he is really hammered because he's not putting up too much of a fight. I take a good shot to his jaw and lay him out flat. He's on the ground on his back, making that little snorting noise people make when they get knocked out. I scramble to my feet and see his wife also scrambling to hers, and now she is screaming bloody murder that I killed her husband. I yell at her to calm down. He's not dead, he's just knocked out. She doesn't seem to care and lunges towards me, still holding onto this log. So I kind of sidestep her, put my foot out and trip her, and as she's going by, I grab her by the back of the head and slammed her down on the ground on top of her husband. Now, I don't believe in hitting women, but I was not going to get hit by a log again. Adrenaline is flowing through me, and I'm totally freaking out. I don't fight. I hate fighting, but I knew I had to do something in this circumstance. Now my wife is out of the tent, screaming and crying, and I yell at her, did you call the fucking forest ranger? And then I immediately apologized for swearing and yelling, but by now other people are coming out of their tents and shining lights around and asking what's going on. The guy from the couple that we had met the day before came over, looked down and said, what the heck happened here? I gave him a brief synopsis of what had happened, and he shook his head and said, I'll stick around until help comes. Now here's another freaky part, probably the scariest. Their weirdo kid is running at us with what looks like a samurai sword. He's also yelling at the top of his lungs, swinging this thing around. And the guy that I had just met the day before kind of looked at him as if the kid was running up to him, grabbed the kid's arm, twisted it so he knocked the sword out of his hands and onto the ground. The kid cried out, and the guy told him to sit down and shut up. The kid started crying, but he did what he was told. 5 minutes later, here come the flashing lights. It's not the forest ranger, it's the state police, who apparently take over security of the campground after dark. The guy and his wife are still out of it, and I was happy that it gave me a chance to tell the trooper what had happened. I didn't need their nonsense story interrupting anything. He told me to stand back with my family while he goes and gets the two, and my newfound friend kind of corroborated what I said by saying that the kid, pointing to the kid sitting there, was picking on his kids for the last 3 days while they were playing kickball. The trooper tells us all to stand back again and gets on the radio to speak with someone else. He's helping these two idiots to their feet, and they're groggy but coming to. Another patrol car pulls up, and as I'm standing back with my wife and kids, who are now wide awake standing there next to me, wondering what the heck is going on, they start questioning the two who were coming up with a story that made absolutely no sense. It was totally disjointed, it was all over the place, but the gist of it was about how I went over to their campsite in the middle of the night and invited them over to ours. That was clearly not the case, and the troopers weren't buying it. After more conversations and more people coming out of their campsites to see what was up, the troopers finally take the father away in cuffs, and the woman was screaming. They advised her to take their son back to their campsite for the night, and that they would be back to speak to her tomorrow. They asked me if I wanted to press charges against the woman for hitting me, and I said, no, I don't want anything like that. The guy was getting charged with assault, being drunk in public, and something else I can't remember what it was, disorderly conduct or something. Both of them were also going to be charged with menacing, and it was also later determined that they had some kind of prescription drugs in their tent they were not supposed to have, so that made their day even worse. Everything broke up and we went back to our tents, and I had a hard time going to sleep with the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. The next morning when we woke up, the troopers were already at the campsite up the way, and it looked like they were helping her pack things up. Another car came up and took the little boy away, and then the woman was taken away in cuffs as well. From what a trooper told me later in the week when I stopped him at the commissary, CPS got involved and were taking the child from the couple. I guess this was not the first time they had a run-in with the law. Looking back on everything now, this is not a story that a lot of people will think is scary. But I'll tell you what, when you've got a guy waving a knife at you, his wife hitting you, and then his kid running at you with a sword, yeah, that's a little unnerving. I feel kind of sorry for that kid, and I wonder what happened to him from time to time, and sometimes my son asks me what happened to all three. I don't know what to tell him because I have no idea. It's amazing what people will do over something as stupid as a video game and a kid not getting what he wants. I'm so glad I don't raise my kids that way, and none of his friends are raised that way. Just goes to show you, even at a nice, polite campground, stuff can go sideways. We've been back there a number of times, and even tried to schedule the same week with some of the people that we met so our kids can play, and we can all hang out and have adult happy hours and that sort of thing. We talk about this incident from time to time and remark that none of us had ever seen anything like that, and probably never will again. Hey gang, thought I would share this story with you, and I know I've mentioned this place before, but I'd never told this story. When I was a lad, many moons ago, I was involved with a group that would go on canoe trips and snowshoe trips to one of the most beautiful places in the world, one of my favorite places to go. It's Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. And for whatever reason, the first trip I went on, I was in 8th grade, and normally they only let high school kids go. But for some reason, I got to go on this one, and I was down. I couldn't wait. First time I was out there. You left on a Thursday evening, I believe, a Wednesday or Thursday evening, from where I live in Western New York. Now, where we go is about 3 hours north of Toronto, and Toronto's 1 hour and a half from where I live on a good day. So you get there at night, and a young lady was a senior in high school. This is her first trip too. Was so excited about it, but we learned something about her pretty fast once we got there. So as I was saying, you get there at night, you camp, and the real trip starts the next morning. And it starts out pretty easy. Usually you go across 2 or 3 lakes with portages in between, most of them pretty easy. If you're not familiar with what a portage is, it's hiking. You have to pick up all your gear and walk across. Usually the second day they threw in a 2-miler after everybody was getting used to things, and if you've never carried 2 packs, one on your front, one on your back, and a canoe 2 miles, I suggest you do it. You learn a lot about yourself. At any rate, so the first day is pretty easy. Just a couple of lakes, maybe 2 or 3, usually one pretty long paddle, and Well, after the first portage, and we're now into the second lake, this young lady, who's in the middle of one of her canoes, usually 3 to a canoe, she stops talking. She's not saying anything to anybody. And people are kind of talking to her, and you can hear so much in the wilderness, especially across a lake. If you've never been out there in that dead quiet where there's absolutely nothing around, there's no motorboats, there's no nothing. It's canoes and kayaks, that's it. Other people are just saying, hey, how's so-and-so, how you doing, how's everything going? And she's not responding to anybody. So we get to the second portage, and we're halfway through. It's probably about maybe a mile or something like that. So people are stopping to take a break. And my friend and I are walking along with our canoe and our gear. He's in the front and I'm in the back. And we come up on them, and we decide, hey, let's stop and have a break too. So sooner rather than later, everybody starts to stop and take a break. And again, she's not responding to anybody. And now people are starting to get concerned. Finally, one of the leaders just says, kind of pulls her aside and starts talking to her. And I don't know what he said. I have no idea. And she just screams, right? She just lets out this blood-curdling scream. So one of the female leaders runs over and she's like, what's going on? And now she's screaming even harder. And this young lady goes into a Class A, holy shit, knockdown, I've never seen anything like this freak out. Turns out she was not aware of what this was really going to be. I think somebody got it into her head that this was just going to be like going to a campground and paddling around. And I don't know how that would have happened because we had meetings and maybe she missed them. I don't know. But she apparently is terrified of the wilderness. She is terrified to be out in open spaces. And she is going fucking bananas, going out of her head. And I shouldn't laugh because it was really scary to see. And the poor thing was she was terrified, just out of her mind terrified. Two of the leaders finally convinced her they were going to take her back, and she started to calm down. So what happened was they went back, 3 people went back with her to a canoe. So they were actually going to have 4. And it was a good thing because what I was told was when they got back to the first lake, she just started going crazy again and actually had to be restrained. Somebody actually had to hold on to her or she was going to capsize the canoe or jump over or who knows. And I guess they finally got her back to the van. They called her parents. They had to come up and get her. And those 3 leaders really had to bust their ass to catch up with us. But they did, and they enjoyed the rest of the trip. And they didn't really talk about it. I learned all this stuff later down the line. But I remember the mood that put everybody in. And, I mean, when you're up there and there's nothing up there but moose. And one night actually we heard timber wolves, which was pretty cool. And I wasn't even aware there were wolves up there, so maybe they were coyotes. I don't know. But we thought they were wolves. Anyway, so you're already kind of leery about, we're in the middle of nowhere. If something goes wrong, I don't know what we're going to do. And then to see somebody go crazy like that, I know, again, no ghosts, and it's not a Bigfoot story, but that was pretty freaked out, man. That was pretty freaky to see all that go down. And there's a lot of things that I've seen, but I hope to God I never see anything like that again. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I know I've been saying I'm taking some time off, and I promise I am this time. It's going to be a best of next week. But I had 2 submissions for camping that I did not use before and thought, why don't you just use these now? So I found a couple others, and I shared one of my own as well. Hope you guys really enjoyed it. The t-shirt contest is still going on. It is 1 entry per person, though. So if you're not familiar with what the contest is, I need to know in the comments below or on my Twitter feed what your favorite scary movie is. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell for notifications every time I update. And if you'd like to hear this channel in podcast format, I am on a number of different channels. You can find me on iHeart, you can find me on Spotify, you can find me on iTunes, and others. Please follow me on social media. All links to that are in the description below. Please visit my website for all things Uncle Josh, including links to my store, links to the podcasts, and ways that you can help support the channel. If you've got a true scary story that you'd like to hear narrated, please email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Everybody, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.